So what you see up here on the slide is it's an article from the Minneapolis Star and Tribune. It was published Tuesday, January 31st, 1984. And in this column, a bunch of school children were posed this question: what is the one thing necessary for contentment? And I'm going to read, I'll read most of this article. Love, special friends, caring families, people. For 175 of the approximately 500 students answering the question, what is the one thing necessary for contentment? Those were the primary choices. For contentment, wrote Joe Stark, 18, one has to be able to share feelings, ideas, and pleasurable experiences with others. One can have all the money in the world, all the power possible, but without people to share it with, everything else is meaningless. Happiness and being satisfied with what one has were the requirements for contentment for over 20 writers. Confidence, independence, and the ability to work toward goals were also mentioned. Money would buy contentment for 15 students. Others chose quiet times, relaxation, good health, faith in God, peace of mind, and good grades. Eric I don't know how to read his last name. He's 11. He said that he has only one need for contentment, which is not being rushed. My friends always rush me saying, get your snowsuit on. All I need for contentment is to not be rushed. Jill Johnson, 10, said, you have to have a nice, cozy day, soft music, a great book, and the peace and love that you have in your heart. Another child says, considering my size and age, the one thing I need for contentment is a small boy about my size with whom I could play all the time and who would not get mad every time some water was splashed in his face or some other little thing like that happened. If I had $1 million or so and didn't have anyone to enjoy it with, I could not be content. And then this last one, Josiah, he was in grade 5. He says, I would like to do just as I wished in everything and at all times. Grown people say, it is not best for children to have their own way. I wonder why. I've seen grown people who acted worse than children. Oh, if I were never to hear, John, you must not do so, or John, you must practice, and other don'ts and mustn'ts, how happy I would be. A boy who isn't allowed to have a will of his own is simply a machine to be run by this one and that. I'm sure it would be for my happiness, if not for my good, to have my own way in everything. Some other answers were very superficial, things like chocolate or, again, money, a lot of... but it's very insightful. Barring for a few wise children who rightly mention God, all of these answers rely on things that are temporary in order to find contentment. If your method for contentment is chocolate, then you'll be content for about 20 seconds, and then it's gone. And how true in this world is that last statement, that last boy who said that in order to find contentment, he wants to have his own way in everything. Don't we all? And have you ever lived under that premise? And did it work for you? Did you find contentment? Maybe temporarily, but I bet not for a long time. So tonight we are continuing on in the Psalms, and I chose Psalm 131, not just because it's I think the third shortest psalm, but it's very it's very simple, very to the point. O Lord, my heart is not lifted up, my eyes are not raised too high. I do not occupy myself with things too great and too marvelous for me, but I have calmed and quieted my soul like a weaned child with its mother. Like a weaned child is my soul within me. O Israel, hope in the Lord from this time forth and forevermore. And that's it. That's the whole psalm. And from this, two themes in particular jumped out at me. The first, of course, is contentment, but humility is also very prominent in there. As far as background for this psalm, it's thought that David may have written this when he was dealing with the troubles with Saul. He was running for his life, but the background I don't think really matters too much. I can imagine David coming back to this one and singing it to God over and over again. It's it's such a simple message, and the application is almost endless. So let's look at these two concepts, humility and contentment, in the context of the verse. So this is the ESV, the English Standard Version. Verse 1, O Lord, my heart is not lifted up, my eyes are not raised too high. I do not occupy myself with things too great and too marvelous for me. And I'm also going to read it from the Message. The Message is like a paraphrased version of the Bible. I wouldn't necessarily rely on it to learn any theology or draw any conclusions about the Bible. But for something like a poetic psalm, I think that sometimes the more familiar language helps to bring out some of the nuance. So verse 1 in the Message says, God, I'm not trying to rule the roost. I don't want to be king of the mountain. I haven't meddled where I have no business or fantasized grandiose plans. So this first verse is a very, again, clear and concise statement in which David is surrendering all pride, or in other words, he's expressing humility. Then we move on to the second verse. The ESV says, But I have calmed and quieted my soul like a weaned child with its mother. Like a weaned child is my soul within me. And then the Message translates this as, I've kept my feet on the ground. I've cultivated a quiet heart. Like a baby content in its mother's arms, my soul is a baby content. This is a simple, very simple metaphor that David used to describe the contentment that he found. And then finally, verse 3, again the ESV, O Israel, hope in the Lord from this time forth and forevermore. And then the Message translates it saying, wait, Israel, for God, wait with hope. Hope now, hope always. So in the first verse, we saw David expressing his humility. The second verse, we saw him expressing his sense of contentment. And then in this third verse, he's giving us the secret to his success. He wants Israel to enjoy the same contentment, and he's telling them how. He says, hope in the Lord forever. Never stop hoping in the Lord. And this is, of course, why he's able to feel content. He hopes in the Lord, and he's imploring his people to do the same. So it's a very simple psalm, very straightforward, and yet it's profound because these two simple concepts, humility and contentment, are linked together, and implicitly, therefore, they give us a fuller picture of both concepts. Like a weaned child, I am content. The weaned child isn't content because it has no problems, because it lives in a world with no problems whatsoever, but it's content in spite of these problems that exist. In fact, the child is generally not aware. A 6-month-old baby is not aware that there are wars going on in other countries, or that mom and dad couldn't pay the rent this month. A weaned child has no knowledge and no concern for these things. And similarly, David is content in the Lord not because he has nothing to worry about, but because he has faith that he knows that God is in control and that God is bigger than whatever problems, whatever circumstances that he has. It's an interesting picture, though. Have any of you ever consulted a 2-year-old child about any decisions, about anything that you had to do? Do you think that Trent has ever sat down with 8-year-old Josiah and 5-year-old Liberty and said, guys, I can't pay the month this rent, what do you think I should do? Or guys, I can't put food on the table, I'm hungry, can you help me out? Obviously, it's ridiculous. And God kind of, in his sort of parent-child relationship to us, he makes a similar point. In Psalm 50, verse 12, he says, if I were hungry, I would not tell you, for the world and its fullness are mine. And so there's a direct connection we see there between what the language used in the psalm here. I do not occupy myself with things too great and too marvelous for me. That humility, there's a connection between that and David's contentment. He's not worrying about things that are far beyond his grasp because he is humble. He is content because he has humbled himself. And humility is extremely important. It's perhaps one of the most important attributes by which God measures us. Jesus valued humility and honesty even over innocence. We see in the New Testament constantly the juxtaposition between the Pharisees and the sinners. Jesus was the friend of sinners. He related to them. They related to him. And yet the Pharisees were the ones he condemned, the Pharisees who were not honest about their sins and who did not humble themselves. We're given a parable wherein Jesus makes a very stark comparison between a righteous man saying, Lord, thank you that I'm not like this sinner, and the sinner saying, I need mercy. The difference between humility and pride. we see the same picture looking at Peter, his denial of Christ, versus Judas. What would have happened if Judas had, like Peter, gone to the feet of Jesus and begged for mercy? Who's to say? David versus Saul is another good example. David messed up during his reign, perhaps as much as Saul did during his, but the difference was that David was open, honest, and humble before God, admitting his faults and his failures. But it's important not just being humble, but being humble under the right person, in the right context. Self-loathing is really just a form of self-centeredness, isn't it? Woe is me, I should be better, I deserve this, everybody pity me. That's it may look like humility on the outside, but it's really a false sense of humility, and not quite the humility that God is looking for. And our pride often is the main instrument that keeps us away from God, feeling that we perhaps don't need a Savior in the first place. I can be good enough, I can do it on my own. Or this spirit of self-righteousness that can come over even us believers, thinking that we're better than others, that we don't need Jesus. Now, I skipped a couple. Now, the definition of the word contentment, according to Merriam-Webster, is feeling or showing satisfaction with one's possessions, status, or situation. It's a very, very worldly, very materialistic definition, which I don't like and I don't quite agree with. So to look for the biblical definition, specifically used in our passage, it doesn't seem that the word content is actually present in the Hebrew text, but rather like in the ESV. He doesn't use the word. He just says, I've calmed and quieted my soul like a weaned child with its mother. So he's using this picture, this example of the metaphor like a weaned child to give us the picture of his feeling without actually using a word for content. And so therefore, if we want to figure out what the biblical definition is here in this context, then we can define it simply by empathizing with a weaned child, by simply putting ourselves in the shoes of this child or in the shoes of David who was using this metaphor. And so therefore, I've tried to come up with my own definition based on that concept, which I've defined as a consistent lack of anxiety, fear, worry, or stress, and the presence of constant peace. And of course, the only lasting peace is the peace of God, which in Philippians 4, we're told, don't be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. It says, don't be anxious about everything, but let your requests be made known to God. It doesn't say, don't have any requests, don't have any problems, and then you'll have the peace of God. It's implied that we're going to have requests for God. We're going to have problems that we have to bring to his feet. And it is by bringing these requests, these problems to him, that we get the peace of God. But the problem with that worldly definition of contentment is, again, it relies on things that are all temporary. Let's look at it again. Possessions, status, situation, all things that can change and often do change in the blink of an eye. And Ecclesiastes the entire book tells us why this is foolish, but particularly chapter 5, verse 10, it's written, he who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves wealth with his income. This also is vanity. Because, of course, those who want to find satisfaction in acquiring money or possessions, that will find that there's never enough. So it's pretty obvious that pride and humility are opposites of one another, but I think it's also impossible to be content and prideful at the same time. Can you be content when you're injured? Obviously, we're supposed to, as Christians, find contentment in whatever circumstances. But imagine if you had a broken leg. You're not going to be satisfied until that problem is resolved, is fixed. And it's interesting to see in the New Testament, Jesus never healed anyone who didn't admit that they were sick. he didn't have people coming to him and he says, well, what's going on? And they say, oh, nothing, I can deal with it myself. He had people coming to them saying, look, I've got this problem, I've got this sickness, this illness, I need you to heal me. But, it's amazing that we, from a physical standpoint, it would be ridiculous. Imagine that you go to the ER and you're waiting for 2 hours and the doctor comes out, it's finally your turn, he says, so what's going on? You say, I'm fine, nothing, there's no problem, nothing's wrong with me. And yet we do that to each other, don't we? People say, how are you? And we just say, I'm fine. And that's often a result of pride, right? But again, from a physical standpoint, sitting in the doctor's office, it would be ridiculous to treat a problem like that. If we don't admit our wounds, then our wounds won't be healed. And if the wounds aren't healed, then we can't be content. If we can't be content, then we are going to continue to try to medicate ourselves. If you had no worry, no anxiety, no fear, or no shame that you needed to medicate, then you would no longer go to your addiction, would you? Now, we've seen Merriam-Webster's definition of contentment. We've seen a bunch of school children from the 80s, their definition of contentment. This guy, he's also from the 80s. This is an article from the Daily Republican Register. Oh, I'm sorry, this was published in the 90s, June 3rd, 96. Written by James Shelton Cruz, he was a columnist and a retired clergyman, and that's about it. He's not some great theologian. He's just some guy with, I believe, a lot of wisdom. He wrote this column exploring the essence of contentment, and I'm going to read some of this. He says, true contentment is being grateful for what we have and are, not in being discontent because of what we do not have. Contentment comes through the willingness to go the second mile, a readiness to accept adjustment and negotiation in dissolving problems. Contentment finds compensation in a world of injustices. It does not fret as it pursues an inner peace. Contentment does not have the capacity for falsehood or excessive ego. It instinctively realizes that love and justice are prerequisites for its own existence, that willful violations of these natural laws create a backlash that produce uncertainties, restlessness, and sometimes violence. It recognizes that most of the world's ills are brought about by not following the precepts of the Prince of Peace. Contentment does not insist on living in ivory palaces. It does not depend upon excessive wealth. Rather, it thrives upon relationships and self-respect more than economic status. Contentment realizes the need for the necessities of life and will even accept some of its comforts, but it will not sell its soul for sheer prestige and materialism. Contentment is never jealous of others and their success. It will seek to simplify its house to keep itself free from complications of accumulated trash and questionable values. Contentment will turn from the constant parade of clamoring fads and theories to find its peace. Contentment need not flee to an isolated area, to the mountains or a faraway island, but may live in its own environment with a clear conscience, a stable intellect, and its achieved goals. Contentment has its share of legitimate restrictions, but it does not rebel. It is patient with itself. It realizes that though it is unable to save the world from contemporary disaster and impending extinction, it has the desire and ability to make its own surroundings a better and safer place to live. It's aware that though it may be unable to shield itself from external danger, that it has an ark of safety in which it can come in and out. Contentment knows the meaning of the words of Jesus, "You are in the world, yet not of the world." Contentment beholds the beauty and sacredness of life. It beholds the rose that is set among the thorns. Contentment voluntarily accepts unalterable circumstances and events. In the face of grief, we continue to lift our eyes in faith. So in reading this, it's very heavy, a lot of interesting language and comparisons and definitions, but a couple of his the phrases and the terms they use jumped out at me and reminded me of something. He says things like contentment is never jealous of others and their success. In the face of grief, we continue to lift our eyes in faith. It does not have the capacity for falsehood or excessive ego. It instinctively realizes that love and justice are prerequisites for its own existence. A lot of these phrases that he is using reminds me of this passage from 1 Corinthians 13 about love, which love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It's not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. I see a lot of parallels between this and the article, which kind of draws a parallel between contentment and love. A baby is content in the arms of its mother because it knows that it is loved, and therefore it is safe and is never going to be left wanting. A baby who's being cared for, not out of love, but simply out of a sense of duty, is not going to feel contentment. And we can prove that through psychology. This is from an article published by the Institute for Family Studies, measuring the long-term effects of early, extensive daycare. In 1997, when Quebec, Canada, launched full-day, year-round childcare for all children under age 5, the title of its policy briefly read, "Children at the Heart of Our Choice." The assumption, of course, was that government-subsidized universal daycare would provide all children the potential for a healthy start in life, while simultaneously enabling many more women to enter the workforce and increase their earning potential. Within 10 years, comprehensive analyses of the universal $5 per day child care program included its impact on child care use, employment patterns, and children's and parents' outcomes, and it suggested cause for concern. Social development among children, as indicated by both emotional and behavioral measures, had significantly deteriorated in Quebec relative to the rest of Canada. Comparisons between children aged 2 to 4 who had been exposed to the program with older children and siblings who had not revealed significant increases in anxiety, hyperactivity, and aggression in those exposed to the program. And with the analysis, they found more hostile, inconsistent parenting and lower quality parental relationships among parents of children exposed to the program. But it was hard to predict whether the negative outcomes identified for 2 to 4-year-olds would persist across their development or simply dissipate. And so that's a child who is being cared for out of a sense of duty rather than love. So you see that love makes quite a difference towards the idea of being content. I wouldn't consider that a content child, one who's characterized by anxiety, hyperactivity, aggression. And so too, we can only be truly content when we grasp God's love for us and when we accept it with humility. We know that He will take care of us because He loves us. His love for us is the basis on which our faith stands, and it's the only basis on which we can find true contentment. Let's pray as the musicians come up.